Proposing in Mehra Madhouse, an Pragya crack fanfiction by Mina. It was nearly 1 a.m. and the Mehra New Year party was winding down. Pragya knew that the time for action was drawing close, but she still wanted to put it off for a few more minutes. Most of Abhi's friends were still there, though that Chipku Mithu had luckily left with one of Abhi's hot actor friends after he'd surprised her with a midnight kiss. Pragya had also managed to send Suresh away without causing any kind of scene. She'd noticed that he was looking upset at the announcement of Purab and Bulbul's engagement, so she made a quick phone call to Racho, and between the two of them, they convinced Suresh that he should go home. Dadi and Swarni Dasi had gone to bed, but Indu Dasi was staying up to keep Pragya's ma company. It was sort of out of politeness, but mostly because Indu Dasi just loved to party. Happily, she was spreading her good mood to Pragya's ma and many others, and overall the atmosphere in the house was very positive. Pragya had decided that she was going to take advantage of this occasion to disprove her arrogant husband's claims about her being unromantic. It would be so much more satisfying if she could meet his challenge to propose in front of so many people. And also, he wouldn't get the opportunity to deny the truth with one of his easy lies. She had been distracted for a little while when he'd surprised everyone with the announcement that she was the woman of his heart and called her on stage. For a few precious moments, she'd actually believed him. Then he'd smirked at her instead of hugging her, and she'd snapped back to reality and remember that she had a plan to execute before the end of the night. Pragya had confided her plan to Purab, Bulbul, and Alia, and they were actually being very encouraging. They wanted her to have a showdown with Abhi too, if only because it would be fun for them to watch. Alia had been busy running interference with Tanu for most of the night, but now she wandered over to the corner where Pragya was standing with Purab and Bulbul. Pragya had felt that her plan was really great, but now that it was time to act on it, she was having doubts. She hated that she was feeling so cowardly, but she couldn't hide her nerves, and she complained to her supporters, "Guys, I can't do this. I really can't. It's too much." "Dee," Bulbul scolded in exasperation, "you can do this. You practiced and you're ready." "Yes, Pragya Dee," Purab joined in. "The moment has arrived and you're going to be brilliant. Don't be scared." Alia coolly looked over at Pragya. Then she touched her arm and said calmly, "Bobby, you're going to be rocking. But I think maybe you need a little help to get your courage up, hmm?" "Yes, I do," Pragya said with a fervent nod. She turned to Alia with eyes wide with hope. "What can we do?" Alia smiled her curled Cheshire cat grin, the one that made her look dangerous and adorable all at once. "Bobby, liquid courage. We need to get some daru in you." "No way!" Pragya protested automatically. "Alia, don't even." Bulbul had frowned at Alia's initial suggestion, but now she cleared her throat and said, "Actually, she's right, Dee. You just need a little something to help you focus." "Focus!" Pragya scoffed. "Alcohol does not help me focus. It turns me into a toddler with no attention span and even less sense of social boundaries." She shuddered at the hazy memories of her wonderfully disastrous experience on the night of Alia's Mehendi. "No, Pragyati," Purab said. "In this case, we'll give you just enough to push you through these nerves. You trust us, right? We wouldn't do anything to harm you." Purab flashed his genuine smile, and despite herself, Pragya felt reassured. "But Ma is here, and in my sasural, in front of all these people," Pragya protested. But she was already half convinced, so there was not much force in these excuses. Alia patted Pragya's back. "Don't worry, Bobby. Everyone is going to love the show. Most of all, Pai. So I'll come right back with your drink, okay?" Alia went off to the bar, and Purab and Bulbul made Pragya get into the right mental zone for her upcoming spectacle by going over the steps with her verbally. Alia returned quickly and handed Pragya her half glass of liquid courage. Pragya was tempted to ask what it was, but she decided that she didn't need to know, she just needed it to work. With a last moment of cheerleading from her loving siblings, Pragya tossed back the drink. The heavy liquor sent a jolt of heat through her veins, and already she felt warmed enough to get started. Of course, it would take a little longer for the alcohol's effect to fully come out, but Pragya decided to seize the moment and hope against hope that she wouldn't lose all coordination at a critical moment in the near future. Pragya strode up to the stage and called for everyone's attention. "Hello, everybody!" she shouted, and soon enough every head in the room was turned in her direction. "Thank you," she said with a blush. "Now, before you all go tonight, there's one thing I would like to share with you." Some of Abhi's drunk bachelor friends started cheering from the back. "Woohoo, Bhabiji! Share with us!" Abhi had been standing frozen in surprise, but at that he turned and glared at his friends until they quieted down. Then he looked back at the stage, and he seemed confused as to what was happening. "My husband, everyone's favorite rock star." Pragya waved at Abhi with a grin, and the crowd cheered for him. "The man of the hour, the king of all our hearts," Pragya continued with an arch smile, not meeting Abhi's eyes, but instead looking out over the crowd and sharing small winks with some of the guests. "With a long trail of loves and conquests behind him." Abhi's rowdy bachelor friends started hooting and laughing at that, and most of the other guests looked intrigued and amused. But Abhi himself was looking stunned. Pragya thought fleetingly that she liked that bewildered look on him, since he spent far too much time convinced that he knew everything about all things. "Has dared me to demonstrate my romantic abilities," Pragya concluded, raising her eyebrows as high as she could so that the crowd could see her exaggerated expression. She paused dramatically to let the implication of her statement hit her listeners, and sure enough there was soon a ripple of shock running through the room as people whispered in surprise about what Pragya might be about to demonstrate. Pragya cleared their doubts by clarifying brightly, "My abilities to talk romantically, that is." A wave of laughter swept the crowd, and Pragya leaned her head to one side to acknowledge their amusement. Then she finally turned to face Abhi and stretched her arm out to him. "So, I would like to invite him up here and show all of you just how fully able I am to express my feelings for my tricky superstar of a husband." Abhi was looking at her with something between a curious smile and a confused frown, and he made no move to join her on the stage. But the assembled guests started clapping and shouting for him to get on with it, and Alia gave him a helpful shove forward, so he bowed to the pressure and walked up to her. "What are you up to, Jashmish?" he demanded in an undertone when he was close enough to whisper in her ear. He smiled and nodded and waved his hands to the crowd so they couldn't tell that he was being bossy with her. Pragya ignored the small thrill she always got from feeling his breath so close to her skin. The combination of alcohol and adrenaline was indeed helping her keep focused on her plan, so she just smiled at him and whispered back, "You just stand here and watch, Rockstar." She led him to the center of the stage and made a point of showing that she was positioning him to simply stand still. Finally, she stepped back and turned to the crowd. "Now, I will admit that I will be borrowing a voice and some magical words in my demonstration tonight, but I hope you will all be able to see that the meaning behind everything comes straight from me." She took a deep breath and took one more sweeping glance at everyone watching her. "So, are we ready?" she asked in her best attempt at a club announcer voice. Everyone clapped and called out words of encouragement. Pragya saw that her mother was looking surprised and excited, while Indudasi was visibly vibrating with glee. Bulbul, Alia, and Purab were giving her a thumbs up, while Akash, who was back with the DJ, gave her a nod to indicate that the music was ready. She turned back to Abhi and noticed that he had put his hands on his hips instead of standing like a statue as she'd arranged. But that was all right. It wouldn't really affect her demonstration. She cleared her throat and said loud enough for all to hear, but looking deeply in Abhi's eyes, "Abhishek Mira, this is how I feel about you." Then she took her position standing in front of Abhi, but at an angle so that both he and the party guests could see her face. End of part 1. Part 2 of Proposing in Mehra Madhouse, an Abhi Pragya crack fanfiction by Mina. Abhi's eyes were glued to Pragya. He was trying to hide his confusion behind an expectant smirk because he didn't want to show the crowd that Pragya had managed to surprise him. He wondered what on earth she was up to. He had never expected that she would take his proposal challenge so seriously. He had imagined that he would just tease her in private until she admitted that she was just too shy to make romantic declarations. He thought that maybe she would try to propose in the privacy of their bedroom at the last minute before her time ran out. She would blush and stutter and try to begin with something like, "Suniye, main aapko," but then she'd be too embarrassed to finish the sentence and he'd win the challenge. He had been looking forward to those blushes because she looked so cute when she got embarrassed by romantic feelings. He discovered that it was fun to watch as her cheeks turned red. He was fascinated by how her wide eyes grew somehow wider while her pretty lips fought against her instinctive self-consciousness to get out the words she found so hard to say. Now it looked like his amazing judgment had actually planned something quite different, and he would have to share his proposal moment with this whole ridiculous crowd of party guests. He was disappointed, but as he watched her theatrically take her position and nod to the DJ at the back of the room, his disappointment took a back seat to concern. He really hoped she wasn't about to start something she couldn't finish. Suddenly, the music started. The backtrack was scratchy, like the soundtrack of an old film. Abhi realized that was because it was the soundtrack of an old film when the introductory percussion gave way to the unmistakably rich voice of Kishore Kumar. Pragya stayed motionless in her starting position as the playback track began with Kumar humming the beginning of the song.
अरे हे ला 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 ला.
Then the lyrics began, and so did Pragya's special demonstration, a carefully choreographed dance.
मेरे सामने वाली खिड़की में.
Quick as a flash, Pragya set her hands on her heart. Then she leaned forward and stretched her arms out, as if presenting a window to her audience. She sketched a neat square in the air in front of her with her fingertips. The party guests started to laugh in warm appreciation, and some applause was heard as everyone recognized the old song and realized what kind of performance Pragya had prepared. Abhi was still too amazed by this turn of events to do anything more than stare at his wife. He did have enough self-control not to let his jaw drop open, but it was a close thing. Pragya leaned toward Abhi on her tiptoes and delicately waved her hands to outline a large circle around his face, clearly suggesting that he was the moon. She slowly walked around him as she repeated her window sketching and moon outlining motions to match the repetition of the first two lines of the song.
अफसोस ये है कि वो हमसे कुछ उखड़ा उखड़ा रहता.
Pragya pulled away from Abhi, leaning back on her heels. She flung an arm up to her head like a filmy damsel in distress, and then she twirled her hands out to show the distance between them.
जिस रोज से देखा है उसको हम शमा जलाना भूल गए.
Pragya turned back to the audience with a huge smile, waving her hand at Abhi to indicate the object of her gaze. She pressed her palms to her cheeks to show her excitement at seeing him, and then she raised her hand to shade her eyes as if protecting them from an overbright sun.
दिल थाम के ऐसे बैठे हैं.
Pragya thumped her fist to her chest, miming her heart locking in place. In the next moment, she was somehow seated cross-legged on the floor, her movement so elegant that Abhi hadn't even realized she was sitting down.
कहीं आना जाना भूल गए.
While sitting down, Pragya raised her hand in sailor fashion again, peering around at all the places she wasn't going while lost in admiration of her beloved.
अब 8 पहर इन आँखों में.
She sprang to her feet and spread her arms out to the audience in an expansive gesture. Then she flicked her glasses with her knuckle to bring attention to her eyes, which earned a wave of appreciative chuckles from this crowd.
वो चंचल मुखड़ा रहता है.
All of a sudden, she was right up against him, leaning on his shoulder and looking at him with exaggerated dreaminess. She drew a circle around his face again, and then, She actually stood on her toes to kiss his cheek. Before Abhi could react to that, the music came to a grand conclusion, and the party guests started cheering and clapping for Pragya. His stage instincts took over, and he tugged her into a side hug for the audience's benefit, smiling because he knew that that was what they wanted to see. Abhi decided he'd play pleased husband for the rest of the party, but in his head he was busy plotting how he would answer Jashmish's grand proposal when they were alone again. End of Part 2. Part 3 of Proposing in Mehra Madhouse, an Abhi Pragya crack fanfiction by Mina. An hour later, the party was finally over and Pragya was free to relax. After her performance, everyone had come to congratulate her. Bulbul had hugged her, squealing about her awesome moves, and even Alia squeezed her shoulder in praise. Indudasi couldn't stop crowing about her verve, and her mother was full of complaints about her supposedly hiding her talent for years. Abhi was the only person whose reaction remained a mystery. He had hugged her when she finished, but she knew he was only performing for the crowd. Her tide of well-wishers had separated them, and she hadn't seen much of him for the rest of the party. She was just taking down her hair when Abhi came into their bedroom. Her nerves jumped at his presence, but she told herself that she could stay cool and unaffected. She made a production of tucking away the flowers that had held her bun in place. In her peripheral vision, she could see that he was approaching her. An expectant tension kept her feet planted, but she had just enough control of herself to avoid looking at him. She knew once he saw her anxious face, he'd find an instant opening for his teasing games, and she didn't want to give him the upper hand. Abhi leaned against the vanity with his back to the mirror, his arms crossed in a typically insouciant pose. "So, Jashmish," he drawled. The rich, low tone of his voice sent a shiver up Pragya's spine, but she bit her lip and suppressed it. "Okay, I'll give you credit for trying. You did a great job out there," he continued, sounding like a football coach praising his weakest player. Pragya frowned, unable to ignore the spike of hurt feelings his words were causing. She should have been prepared for another rejection. She should have known better than to play along with his games. But had it been so wrong to believe she could legitimately impress him by pushing herself so far to prove a point? Just the thing is, that kind of public demonstration thing is for dudes. Girls aren't supposed to propose like that, Abhi concluded. He picked up one of the bangles lying loose on the vanity and spun it around with one finger like a toy. In a flash, Pragya's distress turned to annoyance. "Wow, so sexist, Rockstar," she said with heavy sarcasm, irritated that he could actually say something so cliché in full seriousness. He grinned his irritating grin and set down her bangle. "I think you mean so sexy, Rockstar." Pragya rolled her eyes. His casual contempt had piqued her temper, and an outrageous response was taking shape in her head. Somewhere deep down, she was still hurt by his indifference to her efforts, and a sensible voice in her brain reminded her that nothing was to be gained by trying to match him in his games. But a sharp determination to have the last word for the night made her ignore all that and push ahead with her sudden idea to put him in his place. She smiled slowly and turned to him. "No, that's not what I mean," she said brightly. "But remember, the challenge was to pretend you were my boyfriend and propose based on that. It's different to propose to a boyfriend." Abhi raised his eyebrows suspiciously. "What are you getting at? A proposal is a proposal." Pragya shook her head. No. A boyfriend is one thing, but a husband is another. If I had a husband," she saw him start to smirk and clarified, "if I had a husband that I loved, that's not how I would propose." Abhi whistled lowly. "Ooh, cheater Chashmish admitting to cheating. Well then, what's the difference between a boyfriend and a husband?" Pragya crossed her arms and told herself to stay steady. Her heart was thumping in her chest to be so audacious, but now that she'd started, she wouldn't stop. She didn't know if there was any chance that he'd hear what she wanted him to, but she'd still go ahead and say what she felt she had to say. A boyfriend is someone you make memories with, she stated, faking a confidence she didn't feel. Who was she to talk about boyfriends, never having had one? But she reminded herself that she didn't need to experience something to have an opinion on how it might be. She continued, "A husband is someone you share a life with. The important things between a husband and wife aren't for public view. If I had a husband that I loved, I wouldn't make a show about telling him. It wouldn't be about proving anything." She paused then, and both her eyes and her voice dropped a little as she added, "It would just be from the heart." Abhi tipped her face up with his fingertip. "Really?" he said, his voice rich with amusement. "And how would you do that, then?" A last surge of brazenness made Pragya grab hold of his hand and step closer to him. She put her hands on his shoulders and gave her permission to say everything she wished he would believe from her, even though she knew he never would. "I'd get close," she said, raising one finger to trace his stubbled jaw. "And I would say—" Abhi's eyes had gone dark, and she could feel him going tense under her arms. She congratulated herself on getting to him, and it gave her resolve to continue. "I would say, I just want you to know that even though you're unreasonably demanding—" She slid her fingertip down the side of his neck, noticing how his pulse jumped as she brushed against it. "Frustratingly immature and far, far too trusting." She dared herself to tip his face up with one knuckle and look into his eyes, and even though her heart was in her throat, she managed to whisper, "I love you." His eyes widened with shock, and the words hung between them for a fleeting moment. But then Pragya forged on, still gazing into his eyes. "I love you, and I want you to be happy. I want you to have all the best things in life. I want to be by your side through everything." Finally she looked down, watching her fingers play with the dog tags dangling against his chest. "I want to be the one to hold you together when you're falling apart. I want to be your light when life gets dark. Because no matter how much pain you put me through—" She was surprised to feel his hand clench on her waist. She hadn't even realized when he'd started to hold her, but she didn't let it distract her from the most important part of what she had to say. "Nothing hurts me more than to know that you are hurting." She reached up to take his face in her hands. "I love you more than breath, and that makes me foolish beyond words, but I just want you to know, if you've done nothing else in your life, you've at least managed to win my heart. It's yours to do with what you wish, as am I." Their eye lock seemed to stretch into eternity, and for one beautiful moment Pragya almost thought she could feel their hearts beating in sync. But then the moment passed, and her rush of boldness ebbed, and she remembered who she was and what she was actually doing. She stepped back and patted Abhi's chest, pasting a fake smile on her face. "That's how I would tell my husband I loved him," she said simply, doing her best to pretend that she hadn't meant any of the words she'd said. After spending so much time with him, surely it made sense that she could learn to be as thoughtlessly theatrical as he was. Probably he would believe just that. Then she turned her back and walked away, wondering why she didn't feel lighter after finally unloading her heart. Abhi watched Pragya leave, his feet locked in place as he stood stunned by what had just happened. He felt a little breathless, and he couldn't remember the last time his heart was beating so fast, unless maybe it was when he'd gotten to that bridge just in time to save Jeshmish from jumping. He shook off the unwelcome memory and tried to focus on what Jeshmish had just said and done. He could admit to himself that he was impressed. He never thought Jeshmish had it in her to actually say all that, and that too while touching him so delicately. And even if he'd never tell her, he knew he could never see her as just boring and unromantic again. He was confused, too. He knew she didn't mean it, and she wasn't saying that to him. She was just trying to meet his challenge. But to know that she could have all that in her heart, that she could at least imagine feeling that way about someone, it made him inexplicably uncomfortable and restless, and he suddenly felt a little wistful, because suddenly he just wished that someone would really feel that way about him. The end.